2016, we enrolled in a course on the civil rights movement taught by Dr. Paul Murray. He spent the summer of 1966 as a civil rights activist in Mississippi. For more than 30 years, he taught a course about the civil rights movement. This was the final time he offered this course before his retirement.
I've been teaching here at Siena College now for 37 years, and my favorite course to teach is a course on the civil rights movement. I've been teaching this course now for probably 30 years, give or take, every other year. And I teach this course because I've been studying about the civil rights movement for longer than 37 years, and because when I was a student in college and after college I was involved in different ways in the civil rights movement, so it's something that I think is very important, especially for the last 5 or 6 years. I think I've begun to realize how little today's students know about the civil rights movement. They know Rosa Parks, Martin Luther King, and perhaps Malcolm X, but very little more than that. And I think it's important that they know the story.
Because I thought it'd be really interesting. I learned about the civil rights movement in high school, but never like to the full extent of having a whole class for a semester.
In history class, they would tell you about, the civil rights movement, but they don't tell you everything about the civil rights movement. And I feel like all of these stories that we received and heard in this class was beneficial, because we got to literally sit down and sit in a room with someone who knew Martin Luther King, or sit in a room with someone who met Rosa Parks, or even listen to an activist who has been a part of a lot of the things like the bus boycott.
Our first group of guest speakers included people who grew up in the South during the Jim Crow era. Nell Stokes shared with us her first experience with racism growing up in Montgomery, Alabama.
I lived in my community, sort of buttressed, I guess that's the right word, the white community. Our backyard fence was against a white person's backyard that my mother worked for. Wow. And so there was this, they made a little gate so she could go to work. She went to work through that gate, and I played with her 2 kids, Connie and Billy. They were my best friends. I didn't play with any other kids except for them. Billy and Connie, I played with them almost every day, at least the days that my mother went to work for their mother, who was the white lady. My mother, she never had a name. She called my mother Willie, which was her name, but my mother never called her by name. And when she'd say to me, I'd say, I want to go play with Billy and Connie. And she said, okay. Is it okay with the white lady? And I'd say, I'll ask. So I would ask, and I played with them almost every day for 2 or 3 years. So I turned 6, and I was walking to school. Well, on the corner, as I was going to school, on one corner, I encountered Billy and Connie waiting for their bus to go to school. And I ran over to Connie and was going to say hi. And she said, "Get away from me, nigger." And that was my first experience of knowing that I was different from my neighbors, and that there was something inherently wrong, as I thought, with me. And I never played with them again. I never spoke to them again. And I told my mother, and she never worked for them again.
All right. Jim Harrison is a historian and dean of the College of Liberal Arts here. He grew up in Texas and helped us understand how white people were affected by the Jim Crow system.
We were lower middle class as a family, and so I always had to take public transportation from where we lived, which was the edge of Fort Worth, downtown, where I was learning swimming at the Y. So I was always on the beginning of the route, and I always was sitting up front. Again, I didn't understand the dynamics. I'm sitting up front, and of course, the bus fills up as we move on. A black woman gets on, both arms full of groceries. My mother, who was a proper English woman, had always taught me to be courteous to women. I made a mistake. I got up. Because the bus was full, I got up for her to take my seat. The stares that I got were enormous. And the woman, knowing the consequences of this, said no thank you and proceeded to the back of the bus.
Jim Owens lived in Wilmington, Delaware, which was the northernmost Jim Crow state in the 1950s. He told us about the lengths he went to get a Catholic high school education. As a 14-year-old high school sophomore, he opened the door for many students of color.
I mean, 8th grade, I wanted to go to high school. Now I'm imbued with this Catholicism. You're equal, you're God, and you know. So I wanted to go to Catholic High. There was one Catholic high school in the city of Wilmington. I applied to it, and they turned me down not because I was Catholic, not because I wasn't eligible. They turned me down because of my color. In the Catholic school system, I was devastated. So I went and talked to the chairwoman of the Wilmington City Council. She said, Mrs. Lawson, why are you crying, James? I said, I want to go to Catholic school. They turned me down. She said, we'll see what we can do. She was my sponsor for Catholic High freshman year in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. I was accepted at Southeast Catholic High in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. I got on a train at 7:17 in the morning. I walked from 30th and Broad down to 12th and Christian to get my Catholic education. And my mom and dad are involved in the Catholic Interracial Council, and they're trying to get things changed within the Catholic school and church system. And one evening, my mom and dad were at the Catholic Interracial Council, and the guest speaker was the principal of the Catholic high school in Wilmington, Delaware, to which I had applied and been turned down. And the president of the CIC said, you know, Father Lawless, there's a boy in Wilmington who has to take the train to go to Catholic school. And Father Lawless said, that shouldn't be. You know, his parents are here. Let me talk to them. And my dad said, Father Lawless came over and said, are you the parents of this boy I hear about? And they said, yes. He said, I want that boy in my classroom tomorrow morning.
All right.
So the next morning I walked in, and he showed me around, and the next day, 4 other black students came to the front door of Salesianum Catholic School for Boys in Wilmington, Delaware in 1950.
All right.
Long before Brown and the Board of Education. 1950.
Professor Stephen Gottlieb from Albany Law School talked about the landmark Brown versus Board of Education case. He explained that in order to gain a unanimous decision by all 9 justices, compromises had to be made.
On the court, there's a deal that takes place. Stanley Reed was from Kentucky, and Stanley Reed was very resistant to the idea of overturning Plessy. And ultimately, he and Warren made a deal, which is that the court would overturn Plessy, and then it would shut up, and it would say that desegregation had to be done. It had to be done sometime. The court came up with the formula with all deliberate speed, with whatever that meant. And the court did not return to the issue of the desegregation of the schools until 1968. That's 14 years later.
Nell Stokes was a 16-year-old high school student in 1955 when Rosa Parks was arrested. For 381 days, African American residents of Montgomery boycotted the segregated city buses. Nell volunteered at a taxi company that provided rides for the people who participated in the boycott.
The thing that I think that saved me and allowed me to know that I had personal worth was when the bus boycott happened and Rosa Parks sat down, refused to get out of her seat, and was arrested. And so that particular day, we, a couple of us got involved in a little civil disobedience because the buses that ran back and forth, they parked in the Alabama State College campus grounds. And so some of us kids bought some eggs and threw them at the buses. Because of the bus boycott, I was curious. And so when it actually began, I went to the headquarters where there was this young man that lived in Montgomery who owned a taxi stand and a couple of restaurants. Well, his cab company was the headquarters for giving people rides. And so I went over there one day just to see, actually just being nosy. I wanted to see what was going on. So I asked if there was something I could do. And actually they allowed me to hang out and volunteer. So I was able to pick up lunches, helping people with their groceries, cleaning up around the place, sweeping up and things like that. And I did that for several months while the bus boycott was going on. So that was sort of my involvement in that whole aspect of it. But it gave me a sense of accomplishment, a sense of belonging, and it allowed me to know that one person could make a difference. Because of my interaction with Mr. Posey, when I got older, he hired me as a waitress in one of his restaurants. So I got to work for him for a while. Yeah, and that was a good thing.
February 1st, 1960, in Greensboro, North Carolina, 4 African-American college students sat down at a lunch counter in Woolworth's store and ordered a cup of coffee. When they were not served, they remained seated until closing time. The next day, they returned with more of their friends. That's when the sit-in movement was born. Jeanette Gottlieb was a student at North Carolina's College for Women in Greensboro and told us about her involvement with the sit-in movement.
And the Woolworth sit-in was fairly interesting in that once it started, it snowballed, and students from all 5 of the colleges in Greensboro joined the sit-in, and they sat and worked. They went down there every day until they took all the seats, and they studied. But that wasn't the end. There were still sit-ins going on in 61, 62, 63, because not everybody got the message. Kresge's did not integrate until 63. And there were sit-ins, and I will tell you, I did not sit in. I was the first in my family to have the opportunity to go to college. My father asked one thing of me, and that was that I not get arrested. So while I did not sit in, I supported my fellow students who did. I also picketed, and the day that the local theater right next to our campus, my roommate and 2 of our friends who were black went down there, and the guy looked at us, and I can't remember whether it was my roommate or I bought the 4 tickets, and we just sort of walked in, and he looked at us, and it was like, okay, am I going to make it? Oh, forget it. All right, go ahead, girls. And we just walked in, and that was sort of the end of that. After we had been picketing and boycotting the theater for a while.
The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, better known as SNCC, was formed to coordinate the sit-in movement. The young people who worked in SNCC were amongst the most courageous and most militant civil rights workers. Mickey Kahn was a part of the SNCC chapter at Howard University. In 1963, she was arrested while participating in a demonstration at a segregated cafe in Cambridge, Maryland.
So, in 1962, I was a freshman at Howard University. And Howard University is one of the historic black colleges. When I came to Howard, NAG and SNCC had been in existence for 2 years. And they both included a lot of the same personnel. My first month at Howard, I met a group of students. There was Stanley Wise, who became a field secretary for SNCC. And Stanley motivated me to go on my first demonstration, which included, as the demonstrations talked about, included some training, lots of singing, and I was arrested, spent a weekend in jail. NAG consisted, at the time that I got there, of about 50 students, but the leadership was Stokely Carmichael, Ed Brown, and Cortland Cox. They and a lot of other students at Howard formed essentially a fraternity of people who studied together, got arrested together, strategized together, and socialized together. And somehow I became a part of this group. So we take a bus. We're given the choice. We can go to a cafe and sit in interracially mixed groups. We could go to the movies, in which case the balconies were for blacks, and so you would go to the movies and sit downstairs. And I went to a cafe where I sat with several white people, and the police came and they arrested us. So we're in a big armory. Everybody from all the buses got arrested, which was our goal. The goal was, in some ways, to pack the jails, to pack them, so that people have to deal with this idea of all these people, black and white, filling the jails because of stupid laws, illegal laws. So we're in this armory, and all these people, I have no idea what the actual number was, had to be processed. But at any rate, at a certain point, McDonald's hamburgers were brought in, because we had to eat. And I thought about what I had heard about jail and the terrible food and all. And I thought, I had pockets, two pockets in my dress. So I filled them with McDonald's hamburgers. And eventually our turn came. We were processed in there and taken to our cell. All of us were in the same cell. The beds were, just bare springs and mattresses. So I looked around, and the matron wasn't there. I took the hamburgers out and stuffed them under the mattress, because I didn't know if I was going to be searched and if my pockets would be searched. And the next morning, breakfast consisted of stale, greasy bologna that we could slap on the stale bread and maybe dunk into the cold, greasy coffee. So I told, as soon as the matron left after delivering our food, I said, "Don't worry, I got it covered." Under the mattress, cold, day-old McDonald's was a heck of a lot better.
Albert Gordon told us about his experiences as a freedom rider. In 1961, he responded to an appeal by the Congress of Racial Equality, known as CORE, to desegregate bus stations in Mississippi. He was arrested and spent 39 days in Mississippi's notorious Parchman Prison. How hard was it to suppress your anger and urge to fight back during the freedom ride?
Since we were lucky that there had been a deal and that it looked like it would be observed when we got off the bus or when we were going into the waiting room, we were not directly confronted with the violence. So we had decided, each of us independently had to deal with that issue, what we would do. We had to come clean with the Corps and say, in all fairness to Corps and to our fellow freedom riders, that we could abide by nonviolence and restrain ourselves. How we would have reacted, who knows? Sometimes individuals just couldn't restrain their anger or their protectiveness for somebody else to enter into it physically. But it was not easy. And some people simply declined to go because they felt they couldn't hold back.
So what was the biggest change that you felt you experienced from before you went on the rides to after you got home after having been in prison?
That there was a role for each of us to play. That we could, by our own actions, effect some change. And so as a result, came from a totally apolitical, unpolitical family, anti-political family even. And yet I became extremely active for a decade after, while I was working. I was teaching at the time. And so, and that's stayed with me really, so that we can do things individually that have large effects.
Dr. Murray told us about his experience in the Detroit Walk to Freedom in June of 1963, which was a dress rehearsal for the March on Washington.
Martin Luther King came to the city of Detroit. It was only a couple of weeks after his success in the demonstrations in Birmingham. And so African American leaders and labor leaders have brought Dr. King to town, and they organized a march down Woodward Avenue. Look at the wall-to-wall people here stringing down Woodward Avenue as far as the eye can see. Newspapers said there were 125,000 people there. And somewhere in that mob is me. I don't know exactly where I am, but I do have a picture that was taken that day. Me and some of my friends from the University of Detroit. I'll let you figure out which one is me there. But I was, and this is really the first demonstration that I had participated in.
Few people know about all the work that went into bringing 250,000 people to Washington, D.C. in August of 1963. Mickey Kahn was an 18-year-old college student who helped behind the scenes that summer to organize the March on Washington.
I was 18, had just finished up my freshman year. I stayed down in Washington to work in the March on Washington office. What did we do? Well, those days were before Xerox machines, before computers, before any quick way of copying things. And so the amount of paper generated in the planning of the March on Washington was amazing and astonishing. And things had to be sent out all over the United States to everything ranging from small churches to large organizations in larger cities. The morning of the march, we volunteers got out there really early in the morning. I think we had to be there around 6 in the morning. It was foggy, it was dimly lit, and we found our way across totally emptiness to a booth, maybe about half the size of this room, that had been set up for us. It took us several hours to just organize the information booth. And When I looked up, what had been empty and foggy and dark was suddenly bright and sunny, and people from out of nowhere for as far as I could see.
Freedom Summer brought over 1,000 volunteers to Mississippi to work for civil rights in 1964. Some did voter registration and political organizing. Others taught in freedom schools, where African American students learned about Black history, foreign languages, and science, things they didn't get in their segregated public schools. Luke Cabot was a third-year medical student who taught in the Freedom School in Meridian, Mississippi. His sister Julie came to class to share his story. Joining Julie were Dorothy Singleton and Andresa Coleman, two sisters who were Luke's students that summer.
I'm told by Dorothy and Andresa that he was very cute. And he was very passionate about social justice and right action. And so he began to think about nonviolence, and he followed closely what was happening. He heard about the recruitment and was very moved by it and excited and decided to go, which really upset my parents. And one day, just before he came home, before he left for Mississippi, he was sitting in a diner without anything without any paper. So he wrote a letter on a napkin, and what you have there is part of the letter that he sent home explaining to my parents, to my family, why he wanted to go to Mississippi.
I don't want to sit back while Negroes are being denied their rights. I don't want to let others do it because it is my responsibility too. I would like you to just wish me luck and realize I am doing a good and necessary job.
Well, the Freedom School, in my opinion, was very educational. They came and taught us different things. Wanted everybody to be registered to vote, and they wanted everybody to be equal, and wanted freedom for everybody in Mississippi. My mother said to all of us, well, 7 girls and 2 boys, said to all of us, if you want to learn something, you get out there and you learn it. If you want to know something, you ask somebody. Keep yourself safe, stay out of trouble, stay together, go to school together, come home together. So we wound up going to the Freedom School downtown, and so we went down. And sometimes I had a hard time getting them back home because they would go down, and Luke, her brother, was doing the science class. Now, a couple of the 2 little ones that you saw on the thing there were very interested in science. And they got interested in science in the Freedom School because one day Luke brought in a real heart for them to study. And they had never seen that before. And they didn't want to go home. So I said to Luke, if I don't take them home when I go home, I'm getting in trouble. He said, not a problem. He brought them home.
Me and my 2 sisters you saw up there, we were really impressed to see this really cute, dark-haired white boy. I mean, being nice up full of black kids. I was like 13, I think, and I had a crush on him. He was really cute. There was a cute white boy, and I mean, we were just fascinated with him. We were, and
he was nice to us.
And he was really nice to us. He had the little boy's face. And we played with him, and I mean, he was just like a kid around us. And that what drew me into his class. I wanted to sit with him. I wanted to be with him, and like I say, he was really cute.
So Sister Barbara Lum is a sister of St. Joseph of Rochester, New York. She entered the sisterhood in 1953 In 1959, Sister Barbara came to Selma, Alabama to work at Good Samaritan Hospital and teach in its practical nursing program. The hospital served African American patients from 9 neighboring counties. At the time, its nursing program was the only one for African American students in the state of Alabama. It is there that the sisters witnessed Selma's first voting rights meeting because the convent where the sisters lived was right next to the Tabernacle Baptist Church where the meetings took place.
My bedroom faced the windows of the church, so if you stood on my radiator, you could hear what was going on. So we took turns standing on my radiator and listening to the speaker. We couldn't really understand very much of what was being said, but you realized something very important was happening. Looking out our front window at the street, not covered, but lined on 2 sides with white men with clubs, was quite a daunting scene. And to think of people walking out of that meeting, which they did, in front of that, and they simply walked home, which I thought was one of the bravest things I've ever seen.
The demonstrations around voting rights continued, not only in Selma, but in surrounding counties. And in Marion, Alabama, which was in Perry County, there was a demonstration that was held in the nighttime. And the Alabama State Troopers and the sheriff's posse from Dallas County were there to suppress the demonstration. And in the melee that followed, a young man by the name of Jimmy Lee Jackson was shot in the stomach by a state trooper. Jimmy Lee Jackson was trying to protect his elderly grandfather, who had also accompanied him that day. But that made no difference, and he was shot, and he soon became a patient at the Good Samaritan Hospital.
So each day I would stop in to see how he was doing when I made my rounds, and each day he would take my hand and say, "Sister, don't you think this is a high price to pay for freedom?" And he died after about 5 or 6 days he had a septic infection, very, very sadly. And he became, nobody wanted this, but he became a civil rights martyr.
Jimmy Lee had been buried, but the idea of a march from Selma to Montgomery continued. So on Sunday, the 7th of March, 1965, John Lewis, Hosea Williams are leading a group of about 600 Selma residents, and their goal is to march the 54 miles from Selma to the state capitol in Montgomery. The marchers are confronted by the state troopers. When they remain standing, they are attacked by the state troopers, wielding clubs and beating them down. Soon they are firing tear gas into the crowd. Here's John Lewis being beaten. His skull was fractured that day. Here is Amelia Boynton. She was knocked unconscious by a state trooper. Here are the sheriff's posse, the mounted posse, who are chasing after the remnants of the crowd.
In the emergency room, we treated almost 100 people. One of our sisters started to triage people, so if they didn't need suturing or didn't have anything apparently broken or weren't unconscious, they were brought down to the dining room. So our whole staff, the night staff came in the afternoon, the evening staff came and helped, the day staff stayed and just continued on until this whole thing, until everybody had gone home or was admitted to the hospital. But John Lewis was brought in unconscious and was admitted to the hospital after he was examined. Mrs. Boynton, the same, was admitted after she was examined, and they were, very severely injured and had to be hospitalized several days. Fortunately, both of them recovered from the injuries.
Susan Butler was a teacher of the deaf from New York City who came to Selma like hundreds of others to join the March to Montgomery.
Morning. And the wonderful thing about that Sunday morning was that everybody gathered in front of Brown's Chapel. And ministers and rabbis and every conceivable religious group you have ever known or heard of were each giving homilies. And it was such a wonderful, wonderful example of the beloved kingdom, the family of man, that it's something that it was I will never forget. And then after that, I think there were 3,000 of us started to march. It was a very joyful feeling, I think, as we left. And we marched, I think, for 7 miles. And at that point, the people who were going to be going further went off to the right, and the rest of us went off to the left.
And who was your favorite speaker and why?
My favorite speaker was Mickey Kahn because I didn't know about the Black Arts Movement either, and I just thought she was a really good speaker. And it was very interesting, like what she went through.
Skip out for beer during commercials because the revolution will not be televised. The revolution will not be televised. The revolution will not be brought to you by Xerox in 4 parts without commercial interruptions. The revolution will not show you pictures of Nixon blowing a bugle and leading the charge by John Mitchell, General Abrams, and Spyro Agnew to eat hog maws confiscated from a Harlem sanctuary. The revolution will not be televised. The revolution will not be brought to you by the Schaefer Award Theater and will not star Natalie Woods and Steve McQueen or Bullwinkle and Julia. The revolution will not give your mouth sex appeal. The revolution will not get rid of the nub. The revolution will not make you look fine.
Dana Chandler, talking about the toll that drug abuse takes on African Americans. And you can see the American flag that makes the drug problem American, not African American uniquely. This one is Confrontation at the Bridge. Do you know what bridge?
Mm-hmm.
Selma. Yep. And you can see the image of the dog at one end of the bridge. I mean, there were many dogs, but the way that he's painted the dog really gives you that ferocious, big bad wolf feeling. And then the masses that are marching across the bridge. So Faith Ringgold does a lot of textile works. And you can see here, she makes hating black people a basic component of American identity, replacing stripes with the legend, die nigger.
Who was your favorite speaker and why?
I think I'd say Alice Green from the Center for Law and Justice, and just everything that we've learned throughout the semester, and then kind of comparing it to today and what needs to be done and what can be done. It was kind of interesting to connect, this semester long of ideas that we've learned about and talked about with the current situation.
Our final guest speaker was Dr. Alice Green, Director of the Center of Law and Justice. She brought the discussion of civil rights up to date by discussing the problem of mass incarceration of African American men advanced by Michelle Alexander in her book, The New Jim Crow.
What she does, she looks at slavery during that period and how many people were affected. 4 million people were affected, but they all, and during enslavement, they were thought of as property. And then she talks about how they were their labor exploited later on. She looks at Jim Crow segregation, its impact on our community, and then she looks at mass incarceration, which is for her basically the same thing happening, but it looked a little bit differently. So at 1968, many people said that this was the end of the civil rights movement, that it had gone from 1954 to 1968. Michelle Alexander says that's not correct. we just simply redesigned the Jim Crow segregation and even the chattel slavery. We redesigned it and found a way to incarcerate people in large numbers so that we could control them and destroy, unfortunately. Many people think that mass incarceration is putting a lot of people in prison or in jail for committing a crime. Mass incarceration has almost nothing to do with crime. The system is not designed to rehabilitate people. We select who goes into prison and who comes out. And she focuses on the drugs because it's a very clear example. Because in this country, different ethnic groups engage in drug use and abuse at roughly the same rate. And so if that's the case, why in New York State would 94% of the people who are incarcerated for drug offenses Black and Latino?
For our last essay assignment, Dr. Murray asked us to answer the question, was the civil rights movement a success or a failure? We had to pick a side, success or failure. We could not take a middle position. The discussion of our answers stimulated a lively debate. We began by talking about the impact of Brown versus Board of Education.
Urban and more lower income and poor, it is predominantly populated by a majority of diverse students, specifically African Americans. And in the more upper class and private schools, there are more so a majority of white population. Okay. So the very fact that that law was put into place, it did not unsegregate the schools, it only made a new form of segregation.
Brown helped to create more diversity in schools, but now, compared to Brown, it is more segregated than after Brown.
Forced busing actually forced integration.
Okay.
But, well, now we essentially have de facto segregation because of poverty levels, because of white flight.
Steve, what were you going to say on this?
I think you could make a good argument, in fact, that the North is much more segregated than it was in 1954.
Brittany, you wanted to change our focus a little bit.
The way that I approached my paper was thinking about how legal decisions were made and how Brown versus Board, we were just talking about, led to protesters realizing we have a leg to stand on in the court of law. So it led to sit-ins, it led to protests, it led to Black people believing that like they could make a legislative change. And then that led to the Civil Rights Act 10 years later, and then eventually the Voting Rights Act the year later. 250,000 of new Black voters were registered by the end of the year after the Voting Rights Act.
Okay. Go ahead, Jessica.
Well, in 2013, the Supreme Court butchered the Voting Rights Act, and so now the southern states are kind of going right back to what they were doing prior to the Voting Rights Act.
In what way? In what way?
Well,
Give me
they took away
specific.
the federal government's ability to go in and make sure that they were not creating obstacles to voting.
Go ahead, Matt. What do you have here?
Recent studies done by the ACLU have shown that close to 25% of blacks over the voting age are said to not even own a government-issued photo ID, while roughly 8% of white voters over the voting age are missing an ID.
Jessica, go ahead.
I actually started this assignment wanting to say it was a success,
Uh-huh.
but I really could not find statistical data to support that the movement was a success.
Well,
the average household wealth for whites was cited at $91,405.
Okay.
For blacks was $6,446.
So 5.85 million Americans are denied the right to vote because of laws, and that includes all races. So each year there's almost 6 million people who can't vote. And I looked at the transition from poll taxes, literacy tests, grandfather clause, and now it's become statutes that are allowed in the correctional system that are justified through the consequences of criminal activity.
Mm-hmm.
So it's, there's been a fundamental shift from these Jim Crow laws that were struck down and now there's roundabout ways that have been created to systematically oppress poor people, certain races.
Like success, because that's like a very hard word to define, and I think it's
well, that gives us lots of room to discuss, doesn't it?
Yeah. So I think it's more about progression than maybe like meeting an end goal. I asked members of my family whether they thought the movement was a success or a failure, and then someone said to me, "Well, you wouldn't be born if it wasn't a success." And I was like, "Whoa!" And that's because my dad immigrated here from West Africa, and he wouldn't have come here if he didn't have opportunity. And my parents might not have, because my mom's a white person, my dad's a black person, might not have like come into contact. So like that really struck me, and I was like, whoa, like, yeah. So it obviously did succeed in some ways. In 1959, 4% of people approved of marriages between a white and a non-white person.
4%?
4%.
4%. Okay.
And in 2013, 87% of people approve of it. Yeah.
Wow. I mean, that is just an enormous reversal.
Sometimes individuals contribute so much to understanding and civil rights, and I want to applaud you, Paul. Yes. Because I think
you, Al.
educate this community, young people in our community, and to further their interest in our history and in civil rights. And I know all the things that you've done. I won't go through them all. I mean, you're the ones who take kids to the South and shows them what happened. And so I want you to know that we really appreciate you in the community and what you've done to sort of liberate all of us. Thank you.
Thank you.